So our group was doing the Missouri Public Bank for Sustainable, excuse me, Sustainable Development. Guess we can go around the table a little bit. My name is Andrew Boyer.
My name is Ryan Frisch.
I'm Kyle Snyder.
And then Krupa said she wasn't going to be able to be present today, so it'll just be the three of us.
Yep. So if you'll go to the next slide for me. Thank you. So a quick thesis for us. In order to accelerate the transition to renewable energy, many states have implemented so-called green banks. These entities exist to provide low-cost financing for renewable energy projects in their respective states. So throughout this presentation, we're going to go through the current state of green banks, a SWOT analysis of green banks in general, and then we'll go through some recent development of the Colorado Clean Energy Fund, where we have a interview talk about from that. We'll have the spotlight on the Connecticut Green Bank, which has been going very well. And then we'll talk specifically about the possible Green Bank for Missouri, efforts to date for that, and then the plans that we have laid out to possibly help guide or guide for that. Next slide, please. So for the current state, green infrastructure banks vary widely over various factors. One of the main factors is the ownership structure of the bank. And there's two main variations of that. There's the private entity, the nonprofit bank, which is an independent institution. It still might be publicly funded from state or federal grants and loans, but it could also be privately funded by just wealthy individuals who would like to contribute. And it would have independent, excuse me, can't talk today. They would be independent of government restrictions on fundraising and lending, which could help it grow much faster than a governmental institution. And that brings me into the governmental institutions, which would be pretty much only funded by public funds at the federal or state level. And there would be a lot more regulations on the governmental lending, fundraising, and all the bureaucracy involved with all of that, which can pose a problem to the growth of such structures. And then another factor is the lending model that the banks would use. So one model is to have retail its lending products directly to its borrowers. And another product would be soliciting proposals from multiple contractors to implement a large scale project. I believe from one of the interviews, they said New York was doing this a lot and it's worked out pretty well for them. So there's kind of a large variation of possibilities depending on each state for what could end up as the specific model for both funding and for the lending. So next I'll talk about the SWOT analysis we've done. And of course, SWOT analysis is strength, weakness, opportunity, and threats. So for the strength, well, the biggest factor is the low risk loans. Virtually all renewable energy projects involve the construction of new or improvement of existing property. Loans can be secured by liens on said properties, which allow for low risk loans and low interest rates, which is a big plus, especially in the current state of the economy. As for weaknesses, the biggest weakness that we found from all of our interviews and resources that we found so far is the initial funding is a huge factor. The primary sources of funding is still typically state or federal grants, Although, like I said, there are sometimes private individuals who would be able to invest as well. Many state legislatures are reluctant to invest public money in an institution that would primarily fund just renewable energy projects. And private investors, like I said, could be a potential source, but the rates of return are typically too low for many venture capitalists, and product scales are usually too small for Wall Street firms that would bring in the big money. As for opportunities, the financing of renewable projects is both the main topic of the green banks as well as the biggest opportunity for them. Renewable energy projects are greatly needed to displace fossil fuel-based sources of energy, and many of the funds from a green bank would end up going towards private citizens, homeowners, as well as small businesses, and that would help bring them up to a newer code or get them, new solar panels and everything that would greatly increase their energy efficiency, and that would help them in the very long run. As for threats, the biggest thing is competition from fossil fuels. Obviously, the United States has a kind of disappointing track record when it comes to transitioning away from fossil fuels, although it has been gaining a little bit of ground over the years. Kind of state to state varies on that. The state governments may continue to favor or subsidize the development of fossil fuels, though. So if that is the continuing trend, then those states might have a harder time initiating or at least getting the most use out of a green bank. And I believe it's on to Ryan for the next.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So one of the experts that we interviewed for this project was Paul Scharfenberger, the executive director of the Colorado Clean Energy Fund. And we wanted to highlight this interview because the Colorado Clean Energy Fund is a green bank that was just very recently formed. So Paul was able to give us a lot of insight into how a green bank can be created and formed. So the Colorado Green Bank has its roots in a 2017 federal grant that actually the state of Missouri participated in as well. And I think Kyle might touch on that in a little bit. But it really kind of came to be in the latter part of 2019. And the form that it took on was an independent nonprofit lending institution, which is one of the forms that I think that Andrew described. And Paul really emphasized that this was really important and it was kind of the right track to take for them because mainly for the benefits that Andrew mentioned, the fact that it's independent really allows it to lend in some ways that are free from restrictions and regulations from government rules that would be in place if it were a state-owned and run bank. And that same factor makes it very attractive to private investment as well and private capital. But it did get its initial funding from the state in the amount of $30 million. I think most of that has been issued. I think maybe still a small fraction of it is to come in the near future. But Paul indicated that the fund does plan to become completely self-sustaining, in its own right from its products pretty much right away. Now those products initially will be kind of smaller scale, things like residential solar arrays and boosting the thermal efficiency of buildings with better improved insulation and things of that nature, doing energy assessments and things like that. But before they can do that, they have to build out their staff. When we interviewed him, Paul said up until recently he was literally the only employee, but he had just hired a couple of executives, and they're going to build out the rest of their staff and then actually launch their actual products to make them available. And then once they do that, some of their longer term goals they're really excited to focus on are larger projects on the order of say $5 million or so in that kind of scale. things like commercial building improvements and trying to figure out ways to transition entire vehicle fleets away from fossil fuels onto renewable energy like electric cars, things like that. So another bank that we wanted to kind of put kind of a spotlight on is the Connecticut Green Bank, and we chose that because it's one of the oldest and most successful. It was founded back in 2011. It has a retail model like Andrew described, where its products are kind of lended or at least marketed directly to residential and commercial building owner consumers. Although I think a lot of their products, the consumers lend through other institutions, and then the bank provides the credit backing for those products. And another interview we had was with Jill Bunting, the deputy director of the Coalition for Green Capital. We interviewed her actually not too long ago, and she's worked with the Connecticut Green Bank a lot. And one thing that she was able to give us insight into was how green banks can help out with the workforce development for renewable energy skills. They're not in a position to directly develop skills, obviously, but they are in a position to kind of help out indirectly. And one of the ways that she indicated to us that the Connecticut Green Bank does that is that it has, a list of contractors that it works with, and to get on its list, you have to have the skills. Your laborers have to have the skills to do these projects. So that's kind of an incentive to develop the skills in the workforce. We had a couple figures that we wanted to display some data on the Connecticut Green Bank. Pretty much all green banks that we researched have a goal to reduce the public to private investment ratio as they go on, just like Paul indicated with the Colorado one. And you can see here that the Connecticut Green Bank is on a good track for that, especially since 2017. They've really reduced that ratio and become a larger portion as private investment. And just to give you an idea of what kinds of projects the Connecticut Green Bank funds, the vast majority is residential solar. There's also some commercial lease and CPACE down there at the bottom that make up a fairly large portion as well. But yeah, residential solar is obviously the biggest thing for them. And just really briefly, we wanted to list, we focused on those two that we just mentioned, but there's actually a lot of green banks out there, and we listed 6 more here just for the readers' information. And there's actually even more that we didn't list here that are still kind of in their infancy. But these 6 here are ones that are fairly established. Andrew mentioned the New York one. That's one of the largest ones on the list. And I think we're going to turn it over to Kyle to talk about Missouri.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, so green banks nowadays are kind of the new big thing, the new exciting thing that's going on. Since Connecticut started in 2011, there are now 17 states that have some form or fashion of a green bank, specifically for renewable energy production. And then a lot of the other states, Missouri included, have a type of green bank that might cover agricultural or water waste management systems that still kind of fund green initiatives, but don't do as much as what green banks we're talking about here. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So today, Missouri was part of the same conversation that Colorado had back in 2017 to 2019. So they went through the report kind of trying to figure out what was the best way for Missouri and Colorado to use factors that other states have developed to create their own green banks. So Missouri produced a report kind of focusing on Missouri, the state, the people, the culture, the infrastructure that it currently has, and what it could do to kind of move forward. And a lot of it turned really just into 2 different papers. And that was as far as I went for Missouri, while Colorado kind of took it and actually started creating the Colorado Green Bank. The big challenge that we talked with Daniel Dollar, who was actually kind of part of the conversation back in 2017, was just how to get that initial funding. Missouri in particular, as a state government, one being a conservative state, they don't like a whole lot of federal intervention, but also the state government doesn't like providing funding for nonprofits directly. So that was something they couldn't get over in 2017, 2018, which is kind of what stopped it. There's still support for an infrastructure bank. It's just kind of trying to figure out prior to this of how to fund it. And the talks are actually still going on. Later this month, actually, the Missouri Energy Institute, forgetting the acronym right now, but they're actually having a meeting to try to discuss it and kind of gather support throughout the state. Missouri currently does have projects for irrigation, wastewater, and broadband. It's just finding a way to kind of link all those together into one simplified version. If you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So our plan is to kind of consolidate all the banks that Missouri currently has and simplify it into energy production sustainability for small businesses and citizens. So the main goal there is to allow every person to be able to start contributing towards renewable energy, and also kind of providing them a way to help themselves out. What we mean by that is the low interest loans that the bank would provide would be able to allow the citizens to spend less money on their energy bill. So providing a way for the everyday citizen to be able to update their water heater and little things like that. So our goal would be creating a nonprofit bank with federal and or state initial funding. So that's where this kind of gets interesting too, just because the Build Back Better actually set aside $32 billion, which could be used to actually start a nonprofit bank in Missouri. Not all of it for Missouri, but throughout the states that don't currently have a green bank. So right now, that's where Missouri's looking to use that money, is to actually use some of that to create a green bank in Missouri. Our goal would be to fund 3 different types of projects. So projects to increase energy efficiency. So things like your hot water heater, just updating that. So now you're using less electricity there. Projects that would decrease energy consumption. What we mean by those type of projects would be adding insulation, creating better roofing, something where you're overall just not using as much energy. And then finally, projects to increase renewable energy production. So that would be adding solar panels to your housing units. There would have to be some sort of limits on there, just so the state wouldn't directly be funding large scale solar farms or anything like that. But being able to provide funding where there's currently no funding would do a lot to be able to make Missouri a greener state overall. One of the problems we're seeing too that Missouri has in particular is that Missouri has the home rule state. So every city, every local municipality has its own building codes, and so a lot of the low income areas aren't energy efficient. And so having this green bank would really do a lot to move Missouri as a whole to be more energy efficient and be able to use your money elsewhere, which is really what citizens are going to enjoy. If you want to go on to the next slide. So just touching on our references real quick, we were very lucky to be able to talk to Daniel Dollar and then Paul Schaffenberger, which Ryan's already mentioned, and then Jillian Bunting. It was extremely interesting talking to them just because Daniel was actually from the state of Missouri and was kind of able to give us a little bit of back information just from Missouri. And then Paul was able to help us out with Colorado and seeing the next 3 years of what creating a green energy bank would look like. And then Jill, she works with the Coalition for Green Profit. So she basically works with, it's a nonprofit that works with every state green bank and kind of helps them overcome problems that they have. So she was able to kind of give us a lot of information about, hey, this is common problems that we see, and this is how different states are fixing it and overcoming these issues. So with that,